Hi, my name is Eric Paglia, and welcome to the final episode of the Leadership in Business Accelerator. The theme of today's session is how to transition the financial system to create water resilience for public and private value. Before getting to our panel of professionals that have a great deal of experience in water and finance, we'll first hear from Tom Ferguson, managing partner at Burnt Island Ventures. Tom's start in water came as the lead author of the CDP Water Disclosure Report in 2010, and he now supports some of the best water entrepreneurs in the world at Burnt Island Ventures. So here's Tom Ferguson, closing out the week of Spotlight Insights with his presentation, Pouring Sugar on the Floor: The Financial System and Water Resilience.
Thank you. It's a huge pleasure to be here at Stockholm International Water Week. Now, I'm sorry you have been deprived of the opportunity to hear Marissa Drew of Credit Suisse speak and instead are faced with the prospect of 10 minutes with a funny-looking British man of questionable credentials. But hey, we can't have everything. My name is Tom Ferguson, managing partner of Burnt Island Ventures, a specialist early-stage venture capital fund for the water sector. Now, the subject of this session, the relationship between the financial system and water resilience, is as foundational as it comes. It was interesting to me how this session is phrased, transitioning the financial system to enable water resilience. Now, it seems to me that the financial system is so large and complex, it would be unwise, but very European, to think that it is something that can be effectively be controlled and corralled. I advise all of us to think in terms of macro and micro incentive structures and to differentiate between what we can control in terms of the financial system and what we can't. Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's partner at Berkshire Hathaway, has a great quote we should keep in mind about incentives. The iron rule of nature is you get what you reward for. If you want ants to come, you put sugar on the floor. So let's set a couple of waypoints. Firstly, what do we mean by the financial system? So at least 3 of my business school professors will kill me, but I think it's worth simplifying and cutting it into 4 areas. Private markets for both equity and credit, public markets for both equity and credit, government through spending, taxation, interest rates and regulation, and other. So insurance companies, INGOs, philanthropies, stock exchanges, etc. Second, what do we actually mean by water resilience? So as the theme of World Water Week, I'm sure you've all heard 14 different definitions, but the one true definition, now it's not, but I like it and it derives from a Steve Close observation, is the new or continuing provision of water and sanitation services at the right quantity, quality, price, place, and time in the face of increasing challenges to the achievement of any of those factors. Now, let's be clear. Complete resilience is impossible. Climate change isn't going to let us get away with anything easily. You're not going to comprehensively deal with the floods that inundated Zhengzhou 2 weeks ago or flattened the US Corn Belt in spring 2019. The Global Drought Monitor currently shows alarming disparity between extreme wetness and extreme drought across the world. We've painted ourselves into a tight corner, or at least the generation or 2 above us did. And we have to remember that water resilience is in essence physical. These are pipes and concrete, filters and tanks. Yes, we need sensors and software to maximize efficiency and minimize risk, but water resilience is a physical endeavor. And physical endeavors are risky, complicated, and expensive. So before you get to the financing piece, how do you actually enable resilience? Because it's really difficult. It means water recycling systems. It means infrastructure to manage more extreme rainfall. It means inventing and commercializing affordable clean toilets. It means effective ways of treating more saline water as sea levels rise. It's investment in treatment, conveyance, recycling, desalination, renewal, storage, generation, cloud seeding, essentially a bunch of projects. And to receive financing, projects have to either be profitable or be unprofitable, but made possible through external intervention. The ants need to see sugar on the floor. So let's take the profitable projects first. Now, these aren't really the problem. As of Wednesday evening, Global Water Intelligence lists 272 desalination projects worldwide. San Francisco's $939 million upgrade of their biodigester facilities in one of their treatment plants is one that is actually really quite close to home for me. Now, these things get funded through a mix of state, federal, and private funding through a relatively impenetrable process that leaves knowledgeable people much richer, at least on the private side. And what of the unprofitable projects? Now, these can be broken down into one, borderline, so not quite hitting a desired or required rate of return. Second, returning at cost or just above, but basically out of the scope of the market. And third, unprofitable and a really hard sell, but makes sense for, humanity. It seems to me the immediate work is to get as many of the projects in group one, the borderline group, into the profitable section as soon as possible, and then work on group two. And I think the news here is quite good. So a few observations. So first, reference pricing. We are starting to see a shift in the baseline of what is deemed unprofitable. Now, in Oakley, Utah, the town has been forced to put a moratorium on building until new water sources are secured. Now, what is the cost to the town of the growth foregone? That is the reference for the pricing of water infrastructure investment. Now, the recent European floods will cost insurers about $2 to $3 billion. Municipalities, companies, governments are all being given an object lesson in what the actual cost of water is. And all of them will have more healthy and scary frames of reference when computing the value of a given water project. Mercifully, the main thing we need, that water projects be appropriately costed not only in terms of the value they create, but also the value destruction they help avoid, is happening. Second, public support. Unprofitable is often a function of political risk appetite. Now, solar and wind projects were unprofitable as all hell until governments decided to drive them down the cost curve through price support after 2008. And the result was a 90% reduction in price and energy cost to the consumer of as little as 1 cent per kilowatt hour today. The renewables explosion is as much a function of government intervention in the financial system as it is a result of innovation. Now, third, ESG. Unprofitable is also a function of your own cost of capital and your own required rate of return. Now, there is a mass migration underway of private and public equity and debt towards ESG. That's environmental, social, and governance investments, hitting $2.3 trillion in assets at the end of Q2 this year, up $139 billion from Q1. Now, this has real ramifications for resilience projects. Bond issuances, for example, for infrastructure upgrades in vulnerable parts of the world or for new treatment infrastructure is attractive to both public and private investors, partially because it could work out fine financially, especially with government support from revolving funds, for example, and partially because it looks great in their new client prospectuses. And so you, as the project developer, have to pay less in interest to get access to that capital. Now, given that you are paying less to secure access to that financing, the overall rate of return of the project can be commensurately less for you to still make your cut on the project. So now, less financially attractive projects can get built because they're sexy. But what of group three? The ones that are highly unlikely to stand on their own 2 feet financially, but may make all the sense in the world from a human perspective. There are plenty of options for entities, from philanthropists to INGOs to governments, to backstop a project into existence if they so wish. It's really a question of resources and will. And with water becoming a more insistent priority in the era of climate change, my bet is that there will be a whole lot more will, and water projects are going to see a whole lot more resources. With each disaster, with each demonstration of the financial ramifications of the costs of a lack of water resilience, the willingness to pay for water resilience projects goes up. And the decision on the part of the financial system as to whether or not to finance those projects gets easier. A note on our electeds. Now, governments have the advantage of intrinsic scale. They have the largest balance sheets, the largest access to debt, the ability to make a rule that applies to all actors in a country, or in the EU's case, a continent. They seemed to get it with the energy transition. But why is this support not provided to water? Why can we not subsidize water projects on the equivalent basis of a subsidy per kilowatt hour? I bring this up to water people, and they always say how it doesn't apply. Water's too complicated, it's special, it's heavy, it's locally contingent, the analogy doesn't hold, whatever. But I've never seen a group of smart, influential people get into a room to say, we are subsidizing water systematically. We're just going to work out how. And what are the boardrooms? Now, encouragingly, corporate attitudes are changing. Companies including Microsoft, Dow, AB InBev, Gap have all committed to becoming net water positive. One of the tech majors is looking at a major project to reclaim directly all the water they use in their operations from contaminated sources. Each of these commitments will, or they'd better, translate into meaningful investments in process upgrades, recycling, watershed management, improving water resilience, and driving technology down the cost curve. Technology, my home field. We started Burnt Island Ventures on the back of three core observations. There are more and better entrepreneurs starting water companies, and better entrepreneurs build better companies. The market they're operating in is becoming increasingly dynamic. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still stodgy, but just less so. And third, there's going to be increasing competition to buy the best emerging companies between current incumbents, emerging competitors, infrastructure, private equity, and others. And that's even before you have the potential for IPOs. Now, despite these healthy tailwinds, venture capital in water is spectacularly underfunded. The data is sketchy at best, but there was probably about 200 million of venture investment in water globally last year for a $900 billion market. Now, for scale, fintech received $34 billion in VC funding in Q2 of this year alone. Now, a lot of very wise people will tell you that the technology we need to secure our water future exists. It's just a question of deploying it. Well, if it was the right technology, then it would already have been deployed. The right performance at the wrong price or cost structure is the wrong technology. I can assure you that we are nowhere near done on the technological front. At Burnt Island Ventures, we see a ton of great ideas, but we need more. We need to run more and more imaginative experiments. We need to increase our gross number of failures because, with thanks to Thomas Edison, the more failures we have, the closer we're getting to what works. Zero liquid discharge, large-scale recycling, atmospheric water generation, PFAS removal, stormwater management systems. All of these will be a no-brainer for cities, companies, and consumers alike once we get them right. But there has to be a commercial case for them. We can't blame the bankers or investors for not funding technology that doesn't make commercial sense. The ants need their sugar. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the panel. Steve and George, thanks so much for your friendship and support as we've got BIV off the ground. Marcella and Lawrence, your reputations precede you. I'm sure it'll be a cracking conversation. Many thanks, and enjoy the session.
And thanks to Tom for really capturing the essence of this leadership in business episode. Now I'd like to welcome the panel, which will share their expertise and recommendations on how to incentivize the financial services, such as banks and institutions, to transition in order to create an enabling environment for water-positive impacts. So joining me are Marcella Pinilla, Director for Sustainable Investing at Zevin Asset Management, Steve Close, Partner at True North Venture Partners, Larry Grave, Chairman and CEO at the Glenrock Group, and George Hawkins, Founder and Executive Director of Moonshot Missions. Thank you all for joining me here in Stockholm. And to get it started, I just wanted to take something Tom said, which I thought was a very powerful statement, and get a hot take from each of you. With each disaster, with each demonstration of the financial ramifications of the costs of a lack of water resilience, the willingness to pay for water resilience projects go up. And the decision on the part of the financial system as to whether or not to finance those projects gets easier. So, Marcella, perhaps I can get your response followed by the rest of you to let me know what you think of what Tom had to say there.
Thanks very much. And I thought all of Tom's comments were very incisive and thoughtful. We are a human race that always waits until the last moment to really identify a problem. We've known about this issue of our failing infrastructure, of the need to invest in water resilience for a long time. Unfortunately, we need worse and worse events to alert us that this is becoming a really urgent issue. I'm really happy to see that we are starting to get better as an industry in the financial services industry writ large in asking tougher questions and thinking more about how to design uh, uh, business deals, but also physical infrastructure over the long term with these disasters in mind. Uh, I'll stop there, but I think Tom's comment on the cost of water for the growth foregone really struck me. I really think we need to understand and monetize in dollars. What is the cost of not doing something? What is the public relations damage around irresponsible water use? The expenses after droughts and flooding, all of that needs to be considered going forward more clearly.
I have a slightly different response to Tom's comment. I think before you can generalize, you have to understand how the financial markets are structured. And my focus throughout my career has been on equity, much more than debt. The bottom line from my experience is that water has not been a place where equity investors like to invest. And one of the primary reasons is that humanity believes across the globe that water should be clean water, drinkable water, should be available as a matter of right at a very low cost, which literally has been subsidized over the decades by governments, municipalities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what's happening is that water as a utility, cost of water as a utility, is increasing faster than any other utility, electricity, whatever it might be. And that's a generalization, but it applies to many geographies. So I think that, in my experience at least, project finance, putting up a desal plant, putting up a solar facility, putting up a wind facility, those very often get financed. They get financed by bond issues, by municipalities, by governments. I mean, the EU, for instance, I know has a major finance facility available for water initiatives throughout the EU. And I don't see that necessarily the same as in the United States. But my experience is that if you move away from structured finance, from big projects, and you look at the equity side of the marketplace, and equity has always been the supporter of new technologies. And equity investors, no matter what the hype is about ESG, about sustainability, whatever it might be, equity investors are just not investing in the space. And if you take a look at the equity side of the world, private equity, venture capital, that's also divided into different groups. And you have the big private equity funds that have to invest, pick a number, 50 million, 100 million, 200 million in order to execute on their business models. And that just doesn't work for smaller, earlier stage companies. You also have the fact, in my view, that venture capital firms today have taken the word venture literally out of their business models. They don't like to take equity risks. So they require minimum revenue and or minimum EBITDA in order to invest. And that is not going to support new technologies that need a place to start. Also, venture capital firms, to the extent they do invest in this space, have a very aggressive view about pre-money valuations. And literally, for founders, that's anathema. Founders who put in the time, the effort, and even their own capital don't want to give their businesses away to venture capitalists based upon pre-money valuations.
And Steve, perhaps you can provide some additional comments on Tom's opening statement and this idea that water-related disasters, will actually increase the likelihood of money flowing into that sector.
Yeah, I think Tom was exactly right. And as humans, it's natural for us to hear warnings and not heed them. But once we see them start to happen, it becomes real. And now it's like, oh no, we have to deal with this. So look at, for example, in Florida with that condo collapse, we had an HOA that heard the warnings but didn't do anything. Now every condo community down there is like, oh no, we have to do something, even if it's going to cost us money because we don't want our building to collapse. And that building collapse was likely, in part at least, due to climate change, due to increased sea level rising. We're seeing in the Florida Keys, they're very worried about sea level rising. They're starting to adapt to it. Chicago, where True North is based and my office is we are dealing with a lake that could flood. Now, Chicago has spent over $1 billion on the tunnel and reservoir plan to build out massive reservoirs for holding rainwater flooding. But what if Lake Michigan gets like too much and floods? You can't build tunnels for that. What do? We're seeing droughts. We're seeing cities adapt and do potable reuse, direct wastewater treatment into the potable water supply to deal with this. So I think as we are seeing these changes happen, and then magnified by what scientists are telling us. So on August 9th, the IPCC came out with their sixth assessment report, where they talk about not just the world getting warmer, but the increased frequency of these extreme flooding and drought, these events that are going to happen. So now we're getting these events to happen, and the scientists are telling us it's just going to be more and more and more. And we have people worried because there's, terrible tragedies happening. I am sensing that the conversation has really changed, one towards, like Tom talks about, resilience, which is really like adaptation, that something has to happen because what's happening now is real and it's costing us money. And the financial impacts of what's going to happen are now beginning to be taken more seriously.
Eric, I wanted to jump in because I think Tom actually made a point in this sentence that captures the essence of utility management anywhere in the world. What utilities have been running looking backwards are essentially fire departments. You have a system. If anything goes wrong, you deploy your teams to solve the problem. And as systems get older, you do more and more of that. That's the most expensive way to run any organization, is only to respond to problems after they've happened. On the other hand, you know how to do it. And it's actually kind of exciting. I hate to say it, but when emergencies would hit DC water, you knew what to do. We mobilized our teams. We'd have our emergency command center. We're out in the field. We're doing what we got to do. And we know how to do it. We actually know how to finance it. The marketplaces, the numbers are getting bigger, but it's the system that everybody knows. What we also know, which is absolutely true and connected to the investments and the kinds of work that the folks on this panel, Dom, have been doing, is it's cheaper if you do it in advance. There's no question that preventative maintenance is better. There's no question that you work in advance and know that there's a pipe going to break and you fix it before it breaks. You'll save your ratepayers, your city, your community, unbelievable amounts of money and heartache. The question, and this is a question I have for the finance sector, which is how can you create the incentive financially for the utility to invest the money up front rather than waiting after the fact? You will get the money after the fact. The city will figure out a way to solve the flooding problem afterwards with FEMA and all the rest. It's inefficient. It's wasting public resources. How to create financial incentives. I'll give you one example. We did an environmental impact bond at DC Water for green infrastructure. That's resilience for stormwater. And if we succeeded and it performed better than expected, our cost of capital went down. If we failed, our cost of capital went up. So that was an incentive for us to invest in this project and do it well. That's a little lever that the finance world can bring to the public utility world so that we're doing the right kind of projects. I would like to see more instruments than that. And I turned over to all the experts to figure out those details, but so much more is possible when you do in advance rather than after. Totally true.
It seems like a very important point. Do any of you want to follow up on what George just said there?
I mean, one example that I saw, and we've been seeing more and more of this, is firms linking ESG to lending costs. And I think that's really terrific. Paying a higher or lower annual interest rate to lenders or lendees, depending on meeting ESG benchmarks, I think that is a good incentive.
Very good. Now, Steve, True North Partners invests and builds businesses that transform many sectors. Why is it important to focus on water in particular? And what conditions need to be put in place to align the financial system with a water-positive future?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think like in the past, water investments have mainly been driven by like either regulation, growth, or some of these like urbanization patterns. And I think also what we're seeing more and what we've seen is more water investments driven to take money out of the system to save on money. So like efficiency, some reuse, applying data and smarts to be able to, optimize the system. And what's changing now, I think, is this thing about like climate and climate adaptation. So some of the conversations that we're having right now, instead of sending out the fire truck, what can we do from a preventative maintenance standpoint? And I think that is providing new opportunities to for investment where it's driven by resilience to drought, resilience to flooding and agriculture sector. And I think another key thing that's going to happen too is it's like this intersection of, back at General Electric, we used to say that there was a water energy nexus. And I think that term is somewhat dead because we'd say, it takes energy to make water and water to make energy. Water to make energy, that's like, okay, you burn coal, heat up water, steam, and like that's a dead thing. I think it's more about climate. Everything is about climate now. And if we think about a decarbonized world and the role of water, I see two major things that are probably going to happen that are going to present new opportunities. Number one, the world is going to be awash in essentially super cheap or free oxygen. We're going to have a tremendous amount of water electrolysis to make hydrogen, and the byproduct from that is oxygen. Well, oxygen, we're going to have a tremendous amount, and some people are looking at this. It's just small little areas to be able to use the oxygen then for an intensified wastewater treatment, to be able to improve, simplify, make those wastewater treatment processes better, actually. And then the second thing is going to be super cheap electricity. And we're seeing this already in the desal sector. So the price of seawater desalination today in the Middle East is way lower than we ever thought at General Electric could get. And why? Yeah, it's just maybe smarter with project design and how they're carried out. But chiefly the reason is because renewable electricity is so cheap, and seawater desalination, because of the nature of it, requires a lot of electricity. But if you can get that for, a penny and a half a kilowatt hour, it just makes for super cheap seawater desalination. Then the other side is like, think of a decarbonized world where it's all driven pretty much by intermittent renewables. The water systems have to be resilient for that, the water and wastewater systems, which is going to require transformations and new investments. So like today, our water and wastewater systems, they just operate 24/7 steady eddy, pulling from a stable, steady grid. In a decarbonized world, the grids are going to be overloaded and congested with renewables at times. And it's going to be cheapest, just like in seawater desalination, to take that electricity directly from the renewable source. But the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So these wastewater and water systems, to use this super cheap electricity, which is going to be what's available, but it's intermittent, are going to have to be more adaptive and more resilient. So I think as we shift from an energy water nexus world to a climate adaptation, a decarbonized, cheap renewable electricity world, that the water and wastewater sector has to change. It must change. And I think there's new investment opportunities that come with this.
Oh, very interesting. Now, Larry, you run the Glenrock Group. What are your recommendations to accelerate investments in both companies and funds focused on ESG?
I think you really have to focus on changing people's attitudes and perceptions, and you have to basically get institutional investments to think more about investors, to think more about supporting ESG and not just IRRs. The fact remains is that institutional investors have shared away from investing in funds that tout ESG, because literally every institutional investor has a fiduciary obligation to its constituency, and that fiduciary obligation is linked to IRRs. And water has not been, at least on the equity side, has not been a good provider of IRRs in the past. So I think you need to get institutional investors to change their mindset for investing in funds that invest in water. I also think that the government has a role. I know, for instance, back 25 years ago, the SBA created the equity opportunity, actually created SBICs and gave them the ability to invest equity in particular companies. So I think the government here in the United States and the EU as well probably has a role to play in using capital, government capital, public capital, to support equity investments in companies. And I think finally, I referred to previously the issue of fiduciary obligations. I think the government has an opportunity, and it's a state issue in the United States, to actually modify the fiduciary obligation requirements legally to allow institutional investors and managers of venture capital funds to have more flexibility in their decisions with respect to investing in companies that support ESG with new technologies. So I think that there is a public and private approach to this that needs to be focused on and needs to be worked on by people who care.
Now, George, how do you think the financial system should be leveraged to achieve net positive water impacts? And are there any particular projects that you're really excited about at the moment?
Oh, good God, I'm excited about so much in the water sector, I wouldn't even know where to start. We never called it wastewater. It was enriched water at DC Water. There was so much revenue that you can generate if you think of a water utility in a different way. But here's my take on this question. And the one part of Tom's presentation, which is fantastic, that I was not as sure about is it's certainly true that when he says, well, we always need new innovation and new ideas and we have to drive forward. Totally right. We had a big R&D program at DC Water, probably the biggest in the public sector, and patents and all the rest. However, it is my belief that right now there exists a suite of technologies that have been identified and developed that would fundamentally change most utilities' balance sheet and the manner in which they operate. And the question of the time for me is, why aren't more of these projects happening when there are technologies that are field tested and proven and can reduce costs and generate clean energy and do all these incredible things with preventative rather than reactive? And to me, for most of the utilities I've been working with in Moonshot, it's not the financial aspect that's the challenge, because you don't have a financial evaluation until you have a project identified and scoped. It's the pre-development effort for a underserved community that they don't have, in my experience, the time. It's not a capacity. They're running the fire department every day, putting their head up. What's out there? What is relevant to us? How would we put together a project? What would it look like? What would be the ROI? Most of these utilities are wonderful people, hardworking, very intelligent, but they don't have the capacity. Water sector is different than telecoms. Water sector is different than finance or electricity. There's tens of thousands of small utilities that do not have the capacity to identify. So it's pre-development. The question is how to build a financial instrument that supports the pre-development creation of the concept project and the financial parameters that then can be paid back once the project is put in place. Because it's my view that there are dozens and dozens of opportunities at utilities to reduce costs, improve efficiency, improve performance, be more resilient that aren't happening. And they're not happening because they're not even getting to the starting gate. The utilities that need to have that support to get there is where I think the big question sits in my judgment, how to get to the line so that you're ready to go. Private finance or public finance will be ready when there's good projects at hand. It's getting the projects developed that's the limitation in my experience.
Okay, Marcella, at Zevin Asset Management, you specialize in risk minimization and socially responsible investing. Now, can you tell us what do companies need to do to meet investor needs now and for future water disclosures and reporting?
Let me just say that disclosure won't save us, but we do need it. We need information from companies to understand how they're positioning themselves to respond and to do it nimbly and quickly. So, number one, we need companies to think more long term. To Larry's earlier comment about changing attitudes, how can we shift to thinking a little bit more long term? Because we had a very challenging previous administration here in the US where, for example, the EPA was essentially gutted. So rolling back all of these clean water rule regulations, they eased essentially the path for the worst polluters. So as investors, we are long-term investors. We weigh the risks of companies falling behind in innovating their way out of these environmental challenges through the solutions that George was describing, for example. Those companies that are just going, just racing to the bottom and thinking short term are not, in our view, building resiliency in their core business. And that's what we want to see. We like to see companies setting goals and targets to reduce water use. Obviously, starting with the regions or water basins where they are facing the most water scarcity or water stress. This is a sign for us that they're thinking ahead. Also, we see it now. I mean, the AR6 mentioned water over 3,000 times. It is not hiding in there that we need more attention on water if we're talking about climate. So more direct linkages between water risk and climate change reporting needs to happen. And I think also we need more demand of this kind of information and how it's going to affect a business model. We might not be able to see it immediately in the bottom line, except when there's an event. But it's more about how is a company investing in the future and how is the board involved? Because the CEO might come and go, but if you set up a governance structure that is board approved and board overseen and led, then we have assurance that companies are thinking about water risk and disclosure. Obviously, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board is making leaps and bounds in this regard, but we're running out of time. Just two more points. We are seeing more companies report on their water consumption and how climate might affect them. I mean, we have Zevin Asset Management and other investors actually have written to the SEC to ask the SEC to mandate more disclosure related to climate, and that includes transition risks, and it includes how are you positioning yourself to manage the next water event, the flood, the next drought. So that's something we're keeping our eyes on. We want to see more disclosure there. And finally, I think we at Zevin, we're not a huge firm. We don't own thousands of stocks, but those large institutional investors that do rely on third-party ESG research. And I think we need to collectively disaggregate our ESG ratings and distinguish what's disclosure and what's performance, because you might have a company that discloses a lot and they get great ratings for that, but the performance is poor. So we need to focus more on what companies are doing, and kudos to all the reporting people out there. And it's a tough job, but we need more action.
Well, we're almost out of time for this panel, so I'd like to actually stay on the ESG topic for a moment to close things out and ask for your comments from each of the four of you to finish off this episode. So how do you see the growing water crisis as perhaps creating a new ESG market? And how can we incentivize private financing for water positive impacts? So perhaps, Steve, we can start to you and go around the panel.
Yeah, I think that that's likely to happen, a sort of a new ESG water, focus, and I think a lot of it's going to draft off of climate. I think climate overall, like that IPCC report AR6 that came out, really highlights these needs, and it's going to drive a lot of action. And water is essentially part of what's going to be needed for climate and impact. And if ESG is that, water is going to be maybe like a subcomponent, but extremely integrated into this. So more, blue bonds, more government action to be able to put projects in the money, more, community action. We're going to begin to see more of that.
And Larry?
Sure. Basically, I want to expand on something George said, and that is that capital will follow and be attracted to good projects. It's sort of a chicken and an egg issue. And I know in my experience with our water company, we have built models for actually creating local water utilities, producing millions of gallons of water. And what we see is that the private equity world, the venture capital world, is happy to give us hundreds of millions of dollars to support a finance company, okay, where they can bring in institutional investors to support building the utility because the utility can deliver fixed returns, fixed income returns, and investors who are looking for fixed income returns have a pretty safe investment in these structured finance transactions. But the problem, as I alluded to earlier, is that it's not necessarily supporting the development of new technologies. And that is done at the company level. So the issue of getting institutional investors and funds to actually invest in new water technologies that are being developed by early stage companies, to me, that's the challenge. And we need to address that because new technologies have created so many other markets, in effect, and water needs to do the same thing.
Thank you. Marcella?
Sure. And just to comment on Larry's comments on PE, I worked for a bit doing the due diligence for an impact fund and just reviewing each deal for ESG risks and looking to measure impact. And one thing I noticed that a lot of PE investors and that LPs are not asking for yet, and they should, is what are you going to do at exit to make sure that the structures are in place to continue this, risk management of water resources when it comes to it being a material issue and a long-term issue. And that's something I think we need to see more of in my experience. I don't have an answer in terms of, okay, how do we incentivize private financing? I want to share just something I read recently. It was a devastating news story that you all probably read about the floods in Reck in Germany, where, of course, the wake-up call was there all along, sadly. A local politician said that, quote, there have always been floods here like this, but it's the sum of all of our mistakes over decades and even centuries that caused the catastrophic dimension of this. So the trade-offs that I was reading about in that piece, they made decisions that benefited the short term. They selected to go for a boost in economic productivity over a long-term solution to help to protect against floods. That's eye-opening because wow, it's right there in front of us. And again, we're now facing all these deaths from the flood and utter devastation. So rebuilding is going to have to consider, okay, what what were those short-term decisions that we could have said, we're going to have to sacrifice that and think about the long term? There were a couple of things that stood out to me in the practical sense. One is, the trees that were planted all along the side of the mountain were trees that are growing faster and produce more wood, so they favored those. But unfortunately, the roots of those trees didn't hold the ground, so they were easily swept away in the flood. The monoculture cultivation that was there in the countryside favored cheap corn for animal feed over planting more grassland that would help with erosion. That also was swept away. And of course, not to mention the way that the buildings were designed, the infrastructure was all along the river, that when it overflowed, there was nowhere else for the water to go. So everything was swept away. All of this made me think about, okay, private financing incentives, the collective shift to long-term thinking. Back to Larry's point, shifting attitudes. How do we approach lending, financing, investing with a lens of natural capital, of how are things designed? How is it evident that things are designed with these sorts of solutions in mind? And we should really not think about how much is it going to cost. It's more, how much will it cost if we don't do it? Back to Tom's original point.
And perhaps, George, you can provide us some energetic but brief final comments to this panel.
I will be brief.
Passion is good, guys. Passion is good.
My comments, I think, are a good bookend to what has come before. A lot of this conversation is focusing, on my judgment, on the supply. What are the technologies? How are we investing in how are these companies growing and what they're doing? My entire focus has always been on demand. If you go to any water conference anywhere in the world and you walk into the gym where technologies are featured, it's unbelievable the number of technologies and companies that are out there right now selling services that can improve cost, resiliency, and all the rest. It blows your mind. That isn't the problem. There is plenty of new technologies that can improve water services. The question is, how do we get the utilities to the starting line? And that, to me, needs a financial and an operational superstructure with as much attention to how to help identify, formulate. Marcella, I can sell a project that will save Washington, D.C. money if I have the project design. We spent $500 million on clean energy projects because we could. I could put that project together, and then it was invested, and we were oversubscribed with people wanted to invest. There are tens of thousands of communities in North America and around the world that aren't able to do that. And creating a structure that brings the demand forward, the supply will come if we can bring these projects forward. And that's a focus I'd like to see us all focus on. Thanks, everyone. It's been a great program.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, really. Thank to all participants here today. And thank you for joining us for this year's final Leadership in Business Accelerator episode, which I think has really made clear the importance of private sector leadership on water issues. And I really think that, Steve mentioned that the idea of the water energy nexus is a bit obsolete, but I think what we really talked about here today is the water technology finance nexus, which I think you've all really articulated very well. So thanks again for joining us here for this episode.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks a lot.
And thanks to everyone for following the Leadership in Business Accelerator, newly launched in 2021 by Seaweed, together with lead partner, the Government of the Netherlands, Facebook and Nestle, and with support from the 2030 World Resources Group and CEO Water Mandate. It's been my pleasure to moderate these extremely stimulating sessions, and we all hope to see you again next year.